So today I'm so happy to introduce our speaker, Dr. Peter Gibas. He's actually zooming in from Taiwan today. Um, it's 1 a.m. there, so we greatly appreciate him being a night owl with us. While we gather early in the morning, he's even earlier in the morning. Um, but he did confirm he's a night owl and doesn't mind giving a talk at 1 a.m. his time. Dr. Peter Gibas is an associate professor of Chinese at the College of Charleston in Charleston, South Carolina. He received his PhD in Chinese language from UC Berkeley in 2009 and specializes in Chinese literature and thought with a focus on historiography. His research includes the disciplines of literature, religion, history, visual arts, philosophy, archaeology, and anthropology, all related to China and Chinese studies. He teaches courses in Asian studies, Chinese language, food, culture, and literature, and leads a study abroad in China and Southeast Asia. As a literary critic, an author with a keen research interest in food history, his forthcoming book, Eat Mountain, Eat Sea, The History of Food in China, will be coming out next year in 2026. He also is passionate about Chinese food, thus his interest in today's topic, as well as other topics related to food in Asia. So with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Peter Gibas, zooming in from Taiwan this morning. Good morning, Peter. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning, and I'm very happy to be here. I want to tell you that I lived in Portland for 2 years, and I loved Portland. I am happy to be back, even though just virtually. I wish I could be there in person. It's always a nice feeling, about Portland. I love the place, and I'm passionate about food. I ate very well in Portland. And so I'm very happy to be invited, and thank you very much for this invitation. So maybe let's just, I will share my screen with you first. Um, so I will first tell you what led me to this topic, why I want to talk about, what Western missionaries ate or didn't eat in China. Every person who studies Chinese, every student of Chinese studies, like a serious student of Chinese studies or student of China, is familiar with the figure of James Legge, probably the most famous sinologist. So, like I said, everybody who studies classical Chinese philosophy or Chinese language will come across this name. Because James Legge, who was originally a missionary, he went to China as a missionary. He was a Protestant missionary from Scotland. He was actually a prominent sinologist, meaning a person who studied China and wrote about China. So he was a Protestant missionary. He spent 30 years living and working in China, in Hong Kong specifically, when Hong Kong just became a British colony. He built a church in Hong Kong. He was working on the translation of the Bible into Chinese, the first translation of the Bible into Chinese. He is famous in Chinese studies because he is the person who translated all of the so-called Confucian classics into English. So that's something nobody ever did before or after him. I mean, the Chinese classics have been translated ever since, but not all of them by one person. So he took all five Confucian classics. It's an enormous amount of work, a monumental work, and he translated that into English. So students of Chinese philosophy, history, still use this translation until today. So everybody who studies classical Chinese will come across his translation. And those are not pedestrian translations. Those are very deeply studied, careful translations. So that's why he's so famous in Chinese studies. So he did all of that. He spoke fluently several Chinese dialects, the so-called dialects, different languages, in fact, and he was fluent in Mandarin Chinese, in written and spoken Mandarin Chinese, in classical Chinese. So he knew everything in China. He lived in Hong Kong, but he also traveled to Beijing to visit. On the way to Beijing to visit the grave of Confucius, whose work he translated. And then after he retired, when he went back to England, he became the first professor of Chinese at Oxford. They created a department of Chinese for the first time, and he became the first professor. So he was really, an expert. He really was a connoisseur of all things Chinese you can imagine, but he didn't eat Chinese food. And so that was for me something that I was not only curious why he didn't eat Chinese food, but my first question was, what did he eat? If he lived in China for 30 years and he studied China so deeply and so carefully, what did he eat if he didn't eat Chinese food? And then also why he didn't eat Chinese food. So that was like a paradox for me that I couldn't understand. And that's why I decided to look at this issue, what missionaries, what Westerners, but missionaries specifically ate when they were in China. So I decided to look at the whole history of this phenomenon. So first of all, the first colonies, China was never entirely colonized. China was subdued, but was not colonized entirely. But the first colonies in China were Hong Kong and Macau. So those are the first settlements of Europeans, of Westerners that took land and colonized parts of China. Macau was the first colony established by the Portuguese, most specifically by Portuguese missionaries, by Jesuits. So it was not a commercial town. Macau was a mission. And then after that, Hong Kong was the first colony, the first place that the British colonized later in the 19th century. So those were the first two colonies, and they remained colonies until the end of the 20th century. Hong Kong was returned to China only in 1998, and Macau followed suit in 1999. So Macau was a Portuguese colony, and Hong Kong was British. And then why missionaries specifically were interesting to me. There were two kinds of foreign visitors in China. Um, the largest group were traders or business people who went to China to do business. And so some of them stayed longer or forever. Some of them went to do their business and then left. But those people were not necessarily interested in local culture. They didn't have to be interested in local culture. So they could, but they didn't need to learn the language or know anything about China, Chinese history. They were just doing the business and maybe lived in a bubble or so. But the missionaries were different kind of people. They went to China with a mission, just as the name implies. And so they went to China to transform China, to transform the local culture, to convert local people into their religion. That's why they went. So they went there to stay and to work with the people. So in order to work with the people, they had to get closer to them. First of all, they had to study the language to communicate the ideas to them. They also studied the culture so that they could understand better what kind of people they were dealing with, so how to convert them. So that also implied that they, I would imagine, would try to be as close to the local people as possible. For example, share the meals or eat with them or live with them, live next door to them, to be close to them, to become part of the community, to kind of plant in order to be able to transmit, convey those ideas more efficiently. So missionaries were a different kind of visitors with a different purpose. And so you would expect, like I said, that they would share basic things with life in life with Chinese people. And so it surprised me that James Legge, for example, didn't eat Chinese food. Uh, and then there were two major groups of missionaries who went to China. The earliest ones were the Portuguese, mostly Portuguese Jesuits. They were Jesuits, they were Catholics, and initially they were mostly Portuguese who went to Macau. Later, there were also different nationalities, like Italians specifically, but also others, just Catholics who came from Europe. So they were based in Macau between the 16th and 17th centuries. So that was the earliest group. Those were probably the earliest Europeans who came to China and seriously studied Chinese culture or like became familiar with China. And then in the 19th century, there appeared British and American missionaries who were mostly Protestants. And they were based in Hong Kong and then later in Shanghai. So we are talking here about the late 19th century and early 20th century. So I just want to say from the very beginning, there's a huge difference between those two groups, um, mainly because of the time period when they arrived. When the Jesuits arrived in China, they were explorers. They were still learning things, and they soon discovered China was extremely powerful at that time and advanced compared to Europe. So they discovered that they were dealing with an ancient civilization that was, in many respects, better than their own. So they respected, or they were kind of in awe of China and Chinese technology and the knowledge. They studied Chinese classics as well, so they were very impressed by what they found in China. So they had to curry favor and they had to be nice, and they also weren't allowed in China to just go anywhere they wanted and do whatever they want. So foreigners in general at that time were not allowed to go inside China. So they had to really be kind of sneaky and nice and try hard. Whereas the British and Americans in the 19th century, they came to China after the Opium Wars, when China was subdued by European powers, by Britain specifically. So they were coming from the position of power. And they didn't need any longer to be nice. They didn't need to try hard. They basically came and they did whatever they wanted. So that was a huge difference and a different attitude that those two groups had. So let's go first to the Jesuits, to the Portuguese. They were explorers. They were people who went to unknown territories, different places in the world, new discovered lands. And so when the Portuguese were generally the explorers who first went to Asia, to India, around Africa. You are familiar with the story, in search for spices and other things. They were followed. The Portuguese flotillas were followed closely by missionaries, by Catholic missionaries. The same was true about the Spanish conquistadors, because they went to just also try to not only to explore the land but also to transmit Christianity, Catholicism. And so they were trained back in Portugal before they went on the mission or on the trip. They were trained to be self-sufficient and prepared for hardships. They didn't know what they were going to find. Sometimes they couldn't find food, and they were exposed to all kinds of dangers, disease and otherwise. So they couldn't be picky about things. They ate whatever they found. Generally, that was the attitude. So they were expected to survive on whatever was available. Also, the Catholic Jesuits, they were also tasked with taking care of the poor and the sick. So they were feeding other people. And so that required organized production of food. So also they couldn't be picky about things here. And also, they were interested, genuinely interested in studying and exploiting local resources. So wherever they went, they would study the place. They would try to see what new things they could find. And so then they transmitted and spread those things that they found in different parts of the world. So the Jesuits also, it was part of the mission. The desire to communicate the religious teachings motivated them to immerse themselves in local culture. So they believed that in order to transmit the beliefs, it was good to first understand the local culture, how to communicate those new ideas to those people. So they studied local religions in order to explain Christian theology in a way that made sense within those existing frameworks that they found. So, for example, in China, they studied the Confucian classics as well. They were translating them into Latin, by the way, to see what Chinese people were thinking and how to convince them that they should start thinking about Jesus and uh, how to convey the idea of Christian God and all that. So they were in many ways adapting to local customs. They were adopting those customs in many ways and adapting to them so that they could get closer to the people they were working with. For example, before they went to Macau, before they went to China, the Portuguese went to Japan, where they found a totally different civilization. And so they try to become more approachable to the Japanese. So they discovered that in Japan, Zen Buddhism was the prominent religion. So they started dressing like Zen priests or Zen monks to appear like people of faith to local people, like people with some kind of authority to talk about spiritual things. So they would dress like the Buddhist monks. They would also stylize their temples, like the church. They would make the church look like a Japanese temple, to make it like for the people to appear familiar. They also adopted some customs in the church. For example, the tea ceremony. They had a place at church, at the Catholic Church, where they could serve tea in a Japanese way. So some of them objected to that. Some of those fellow missionaries, they said that, this Japanese tea ceremony was madness and barbarity. But in the spirit of mutual accommodation, in order to make the people more comfortable, they would install those hearths to make tea in the churches. Uh, Likewise, many Japanese people were shocked that the Europeans ate so much meat. So they would try to eat less meat to, to basically stop shocking people. And also, maybe they ate meat, but not in public, so that they wouldn't be seen by the local people in order not to shock them. So they did that in Japan, and it worked. So when they went to China, they tried to do the same thing, hoping that the same trick would work also in China. Also, by mistake, when they first arrived in China, they also assumed that Buddhism was the main religion that they had to deal with, which was true to a degree, but Buddhism in China never was it was like a kind of folk religion, but the actual worldview was shaped by Confucian scholars. Those are the people who had real power. So only later the Jesuits discovered that in order to have influence on Chinese people, they had to hang out with Confucian scholars more than Buddhist monks. But they didn't know that at the beginning. So when they first came to Macau, they started to do the same thing as they did in Japan. They tried to appear more like familiar, adopting some Buddhist customs or Buddhist ways. And this is important for us. I will mention in a little bit why this is an important detail. So you can see here the map of Portuguese trade routes. When they went from Portugal all over the world, they went to Africa, they went to Brazil. Wherever they went, they discovered new things like new foods, and then they spread them to other places. So they took those new discoveries wherever they went, back to Portugal, but also they took, things from Brazil to Africa, from Africa to Goa. And Goa was the center of the operations in Asia. So Goa became like the capital of the ultramarine or overseas Portuguese empire. So that was the center in Goa in India. And then from there, they went further east to the Malaya, then to the Philippines, eventually to Japan and also to China. So whatever they found on the way, they would bring it with them and also spread and disseminate that also in China and in Japan. So the Portuguese actually, because they were using local resources, they disseminated and spread those resources and brought to China all kinds of new ideas, all kinds of new foods and new ingredients to China. So they enriched the local cuisine. But this is to show that the Portuguese were not shy of using local food or eating local products. So in Macau specifically, Macau was cut off. So you would expect that it was part of China. So naturally, all things would come from China and they would be have a lot of Chinese things to eat. But China was very upset about the Portuguese presence in Macau. So they cut them off. And they were hoping to basically starve Macau. So Macau is very tiny. It's a very tiny place that you can walk across and come to the Chinese border. There were no resources in Macau, like there was no water and there was no land to cultivate. So everything to eat, they had to import it. So there was no exchange with China. That's why all the food, including rice and basic produce, was imported from other Portuguese colonies, from Goa, like Goa in India, but also from Malacca in Malaysia, in today's Malaysia, also from Manila in the Philippines, and some things were brought directly from Portugal, all the way from Portugal. So they were importing things because they couldn't have the Chinese things. One reason why they didn't eat Chinese food was because they didn't have it. It wasn't available in Macau. So the food that the Portuguese ate in China, the staple was rice. That was brought from the Philippines mostly, most of it. From Portugal, they imported items that they couldn't find in Asia, such as cheese, wine, olive oil, or vinegar. And then they really needed food for liturgy, for the Catholic ritual, which they were very picky about. So bread and wine. The wine had to be Portuguese. They had beef with the French, so they wouldn't buy French wine. But they believed that that grapes need to be proper grapes because the wine becomes Jesus' blood. So it couldn't just be like rice wine or anything like that. It had to be proper wine made of grapes. And also the bread, they had absolutely making sure that it's proper grain, not any kind of wheat, because again the bread was becoming Jesus' flesh. So they were very particular about those two items, and they couldn't do without it. So that's why the Jesuits, they baked their own bread in Macau for ritual purposes. But then they also had some Portuguese foods that they couldn't dispense with, such as sweets and wine. The Portuguese were very, very particular about this. They loved wine with every meal. and they also loved sweets. So if you are familiar with Portugal and Portuguese cuisine, if you go to any Portuguese restaurant, if you find one in America, you see that usually it comes with a bakery. They are very particular about bakery and baking things. And so, for example, they introduced a lot of new foods and invented a lot of new foods in China, in Macau. The iconic egg tarts that you can find in every dim sum place, in every Cantonese place, they were invented in Macau by the Jesuits. Also, there were, apart from the Jesuits, there were also nuns, Catholic nuns of the convent of Saint Ursula, and they made all kinds of pastries, sweet stuff, sweet cakes, baked pastries from Portugal, and they were so famous that some of those pastries even made all the way to the emperor's table in Beijing as gifts. So they were famous for this. And so likewise, when they had the meals, when they ate, the Portuguese Jesuits, they liked to include Portuguese pastries and wine. But they did not shy from Chinese food whenever they could find it, and especially local products. They were exploring whatever they could find in China, and we know this because there's a Portuguese scholar, Ana Maria Amaro. She discovered handwritten the so-called secret recipes that the Jesuits kept in the mission, and also cookbooks written by wives of the Portuguese traders who lived in Macau. So a lot of this, they were using all kinds of local resources, especially particularly when the Jesuits made medication. They studied Chinese medicine to improve their own because they were treating people for diseases. So they would also use local resources. So they would use Chinese medicine and Chinese products. So they had absolutely no issues with local Chinese food products. They would eat them. And they compiled those recipes that they made using Chinese food. So one example here is the drink, very popular drink, like a refreshment that you can also buy now in Hong Kong or in Macau. It's called in Cantonese, Xinzhencha. I cannot pronounce it in Cantonese, I'm sorry, but in Chinese it's pronounced Xinzhencha, which is the horchata, a tonic, an emulsion of almonds that comes from Portugal originally. So it was a Portuguese tonic made with lettuces and extract of all kinds of seeds and stuff. And so they transferred this to Macau and started making this also for as a tonic, as a medication, made with almonds and sugar and other things. So again, they used local resources to produce those things and influence the local cuisine. But they had some theological issues with Chinese cuisine, which are very interesting. So, like I said at the beginning, they thought that the Buddhism was the main religion in China that they had to cope with, and so one of the Jesuit priests suggested to the brothers that maybe in order to get closer to the Chinese and earn their respect, they should become vegetarian because Chinese Buddhists are vegetarian. It's a very famous characteristic of Chinese Buddhism. They don't eat meat because they don't want to kill living beings. And so one of the brothers suggested that maybe they should also stop eating meat, become vegetarian, just to get closer to the locals. But that caused some theological dispute. They said that this would be compromising the principles of their own faith. And so that the idea was rejected. Not only this, but they rejected vegetarianism themselves. They had no problem with being vegetarian, but they said that being vegetarian in China means you are a Buddhist. So it means you are worshiping a different God. So eating vegetarian food is like eating food that's dedicated to another deity, to not the Christian God, not to Jesus. So that was bad. That would be a sin. That would be compromising their own faith. That's why they rejected vegetarianism. They associated it with Buddhism and with sin. And so every Chinese convert who agreed, who decided to convert to Christianity during the baptism ceremony was required to eat pork as part of the conversion. To prove, to demonstrate that they no longer shelter any Buddhist ideas. And so it had to be pork specifically because there were also some Muslims in that area of China. So in case they would eat meat, they had to eat porks to show that they are not Muslim either. Uh, this idea was brought all the way from Portugal, where they would be, careful not to. There were Jews and there were Muslims in Spain and in Portugal, so they were trying to make sure that they root that out, that there are no Muslims or no Jews. So they have to eat not just meat but pork, specifically pork. So that was a requirement for Chinese Christians to become pork eaters. So like with the religion, they had to adopt new eating habits as well. But like I said, themselves, they had no idea with eating vegetarian food. In fact, sometimes on Friday, for example, Catholics don't eat meat because they commemorate the death of Jesus. So in commemoration of that, Friday is a fasting day. They eat fish though. And so then beyond Macau, because Macau was just like a small place, the Jesuits went all the way to Beijing. Here I have an example of the most prominent Jesuit priest, who was Matteo Ricci, who was Italian. So he was a guest at the imperial court in Beijing, where they tried to impress the Chinese. That's the time when they started working with the Confucian scholars, with whom they found much more in common because they were interested in science, in knowledge, and Confucian scholars, they were not particularly religious. They didn't believe in any god, so it was easier. They were easier to approach by the Jesuits. So here we have Matteo Ricci, who famously dressed like a Confucian scholar to look more familiar to the Chinese and speak with authority. So what they were trying to do was to convince the Emperor of China to convert China to Christianity. But so they were guests at the imperial court in Beijing. So they naturally had to adjust to the lifestyles, to the local customs. So Ricci grew his hair and beard in the Chinese fashion and dressed as a Confucian scholar. And he also participated in receptions and banquets. So obviously he ate Chinese food during those in those events. We also know that other prominent Jesuits who traveled in China into the capital, they also ate Chinese food, and so they had no problem with Chinese cuisine. The only thing was to avoid gluttony because that's a sin in Christianity, and also they had a problem with those big Chinese banquets because very often they included female services and performances, which for the Catholic priests was not allowed. So those banquets included music and female performances. So the priests were shying away from that, but they had no problem with food. So what they ate in Macau was a kind of fusion cuisine. It was not Portuguese, but not Chinese either. There was no Chinese life, much left of it in Macau, so they didn't have a chance to come across Chinese cuisine. The cuisine was influenced by cuisines from Africa, India, Malaya, and other Portuguese colonies. But during parties and banquets, they always included Portuguese wine and sweets, which made the banquet Portuguese. So they adopted Chinese ingredients. This is an interesting point, but not the cuisine, meaning they wouldn't cook Chinese dishes. They wouldn't cook Chinese food, but they would use Chinese ingredients. And they had generally no ideological issues with Chinese cuisine at all. So now let's go back to James Legge and the British and the 19th century British Protestants. That was a totally different story. They came as conquerors. They had a very acute sense of superiority. They believed they were better than the Chinese in every fashion. They had a better fleet, better army, they had a better god, and they also believed they had a better food. So for them, the conversion had to be total, meaning the Chinese had to change the lifestyle completely, not only adopt Christianity, but also Western way of life, Western food, and so that they needed to be civilized. They thought China was lacking, China was inferior. So in order to improve, the Chinese had to be civilized or civilized. And so that included not just the religion, not just the beliefs, not just the God and the beliefs, but also food and other things like clothing. So another thing, they were very concerned with hygiene and health issues. They believed that China was a dirty place, and there was disease, and so they believed that Chinese food, Western food, but also the preparation, the way it is prepared, was clean and more civilized. That's why they would shy away from Chinese cuisine. So this is after the Opium Wars, when China was forced into submission, and the part of this was China had to open to trade, allow trade by Europeans, open the cities, open the port cities. The British were granted extraterritoriality in China, and also missionaries were allowed to go anywhere they wanted in China and do whatever they want. So China actually remembers this as a huge, um, they call them unequal treaties. And so China until today has big issues with this. Those things are remembered as humiliation. They were humiliated. China felt very humiliated, and until today, Chinese government is, trying to get even with the Westerners for what they suffered in the 19th century. So, generally speaking, the Westerners, the British missionaries, and other people were not advised to mingle with the Chinese. So again, they considered they equaled Christianity with civilization. So being a civilized human being meant you are Christian, but also you eat Western food, not Chinese food. This was like also had to do with the ideas about Chinese diet that Westerners kept for a long time. When the first European traders went to China back already in the 16th, 17th century, the Chinese were trying to be nice and uh, hospitable. So they served the best food they had, like bird nests or shark fins, because that was the most expensive stuff. So they wanted to impress the Western visitors. But the Westerners, of course, had a different perspective. So for them, those things were just extremely strange and weird. So generally speaking, for a long time, late into the 20th century, many Westerners in the United States and in other parts of the West, in Europe, they believe that Chinese people eat just weird stuff, such as sea cucumbers and cats and dogs and rats, even. So the Chinese restaurants were supposed to be avoided, and so on. So there were those ideas that they had when they arrived in China, that Chinese people, what they eat is just extremely strange, dangerous, not edible. Then here I have an example of some of the missionary writings. Mm, they advised each other to refrain, not to eat Chinese food or local food, or not to get too close to the local people. And they give an example of one of the brothers, Mr. Burns, who was a missionary, a Protestant missionary from England, who died on the mission. And here I have, kind of note that they made to each other. Basically, the conclusion was that he died because he attempted to live as the Chinese do, that he ate Chinese food with Chinese people. He tried to live like the Chinese. And the conclusion was that we cannot be sure, but in any case, it was the diet that cut short his noble career. So basically, what they were saying is that if you eat Chinese food and if you live like a Chinese person, you will die. The food, the diet will kill you. So you should not do that. Generally, in those writings that I looked at, the missionary writings from that period, they often say that they usually refer to Chinese people in very derogatory terms. They call them heathens and savages and Chinamen and so on. And they generally say that a Chinese diet is not fit for Europeans, that it's not fit for the white race, that the yellow race, what the yellow race eats, is not fit for a civilized white human being. So that was the idea they had, and so that's why they wouldn't touch Chinese food. Now, James Legge, when he arrived in Hong Kong had just become a British colony. So it was like an island. There was nothing on it. There were very few people living there, and most of the people who came were British. So there was no native Chinese life there. And then also it was a place where there was the so-called Hong Kong fever. A lot of people were dying from disease, and James Legge himself often got sick. And his first wife died from the disease, and also his first son, his child, also died. So he often got sick and almost died too. So the climate was not considered very good. And so naturally he didn't eat local food for the rest of his life, mostly because he probably thought he would get sick. Another thing is when you get sick, you also want to eat naturally something that you like some comfort food. So maybe that wouldn't be, a bird nest for James Legge, but maybe some toast and tea or something like that. So I'm trying to be, like understanding. So anyway, he was scared to be sick and to die. And also, he often was sick, so he wanted to feel comfortable and eat something familiar. So those were the two major reasons why James Legge probably didn't eat Chinese food without even having those ideas in mind about Chinese food, what it's like. So then another thing that happened in Hong Kong early after Hong Kong became a colony, there was a bakery in Hong Kong that baked bread for all the British residents in Hong Kong, just one bakery. And so the Chinese attempted to poison the British by poisoning the bread. They thought that they would get rid of the colonizers by poisoning, by killing them. So they poisoned the bread with arsenic. And James Legge was one of the first victims. He actually was the person who noticed that the bread was poisoned, and he warned his compatriots because he started his day early at 3 a.m. in the morning. He would wake up and then go to work at that time. So he was the first person who ate the freshly baked bread. And so he noticed that something was wrong. Also, his son, who was with him, young son, got very sick and almost died. So James Legge noticed that something was wrong with the bread, and he warned everybody. So nobody died, but some people got very sick. Anyway, that was a scare. And so the British were not, they didn't trust after this, they didn't trust the Chinese to make food for them. So they wouldn't, another reason they wouldn't eat Chinese food was because they thought they would get poisoned on purpose. So later, the Chinese were not allowed to bake bread for the English, and the service was entrusted to the Parsis from India, from the British colony of India. So again, there was a lot of the British were very suspicious. They were not trusting the Chinese with food. in general. So that's another reason why they would shy away from Chinese food to begin with. So what did he eat if he didn't eat Chinese food? Well, at the beginning, he kept his own cows and goats for milk because he liked to have tea and milk and butter for breakfast. And then his second wife, he married another person after his first wife died. Many missionary wives died on the mission, by the way. That's like a topic for another book, I think. So she was a very ambitious person. And she wanted to be a lady. She wanted to be a mem sahib. She thought she belonged to a higher society, being a missionary wife. So she had a lot of ambition. So this is a quote from her writings. She says, "We make our home as English as possible," which means that every day they ate curry. Um, Obviously, this was from India because the British came to colonize Hong Kong after they had colonized India, and they liked the curry. And so, if you as you know, probably in England, curry is the main dish right now. So it's like it features strongly in English cuisine. So they loved curry, so they ate curry every day in Hong Kong. So the daily routine kind of looked like this. There was a first breakfast. There were two breakfasts. The first one was at 7 a.m. It was just tea and toast with somewhat what they call doubtful butter that Hannah avoided. Then they had a second breakfast at 9 or 10, and that was more substantial with meat, rice, and curry, and eggs and rice cakes. And then there was an early dinner at 3 p.m. prior to a family walk in the cooling air, and then what they call the adult tea after 8 p.m. So the adult tea could just mean that kids were already in bed, so the adults only had some tea. But in the writings that I read, it was strongly implied that they had a drink, they had an alcoholic drink with that tea. So that's why it was called adult. And then Hannah was very ambitious, so she wanted to be like belong to the high society. She hosted dinners, fancy dinners that were like legendary in Hong Kong. Like the best parties that were thrown in Hong Kong were thrown by Hannah. So different groups of visitors. She organized parties for the local British soldiers. They all loved them, and so they always she got food directly from England. She imported food from England. So it was like beef, mutton, pork, ducks and goose, and also a dish of curry with mango chutney. Apparently, James, her husband, loved chutney specifically, which is another Indian influence, but no Chinese food. And the food was accompanied by ale or wine. And then there were puddings, the somewhat elaborate desserts, including pastries and so on. So she was famous for throwing those parties. And then the biggest party she ever prepared, was a dinner party hosted by her for 130 people, men and women and children from James's Chinese congregation. So this was a dinner party, the biggest she ever organized for Chinese people, for the Chinese people who went to her husband's church. So the dinner was Chinese, a 30-course Chinese meal with Chinese distilled spirits. So she served to the Chinese congregation Chinese food. And there are two reports. There's the official report of this party, and then there's what she wrote to her daughter in a letter. So in the official report, she says that, it was a great party, and she, for the first time in her life, she tried to use chopsticks and eat Chinese food, and she tasted Chinese food. That's what she says. That she cooked those Chinese things, she had those things cooked for the Chinese, and that she tasted. She was brave and tasted Chinese cuisine. But then in the letter to her daughter, she says what really happens. So she says this about her own dinner that she cooked for the Chinese people. She says, we had to entertain to dinner between 1 and 200 Chinese. Everyone had chopsticks and a tiny cup with a little tea pot containing a spirit obtained from rice. And then she says, I was obliged to honor the table. I took on a chopstick a bit of pineapple, then a bit of hot pear. Then I had to put the spirit to my mouth and drink healths. The dinner lasted 3 hours. Oh, the mosquitoes. And then they dispersed. So the Chinese food she ate was a bit of pineapple just for the show. She didn't taste the Chinese food. She didn't dare. She wasn't brave enough to eat the food in her own dinner party. And then she concluded to her daughter about this dinner. She concluded that the Chinese eat every nasty thing you can imagine, and every nice thing they make nasty. So that was her conclusion about Chinese cuisine. James was Scottish. He loved whiskey. He had a drink of whiskey every day. He wasn't an alcoholic, but he really enjoyed Scottish whiskey. And then also he attended the annual Scottish Christmas dinners and parties. So I have here an extract. So they made actually Scottish food for those events, like kokiliki and haggis and so on. So they even had Scottish food, which is a mystery to many people in Hong Kong, but they still didn't eat anything Chinese. James went to Beijing and visited the grave of Confucius in Shantung on one trip, and he details in his diary what he ate on the way. So the food was very simple. Sometimes they bought local food from local people, and he says that he never felt so healthy in his entire life. He says, I was never in better health. So this is the time when he kind of, ventured out of Hong Kong and ate some local cuisine. Now, what about other missionaries, not only in Hong Kong? Because Hong Kong was a Western city. Hong Kong was a British colony, and there was very little Chinese life in Hong Kong at that time. Hong Kong was not the place it is now. It was a completely different situation. So, um, Chinese people probably ate just Chinese food for themselves, made for themselves, but the first restaurants that opened in Hong Kong were Western restaurants. And so it was a cosmopolitan city, a Western city, and um, maybe James Legge and other missionaries didn't eat Chinese food not only because they didn't want to, but also because they didn't have it. It wasn't available in Hong Kong. But what about other missionaries in China, in other parts of China, sometimes very remote parts of China? So there were two groups of missionaries. There were the board missionaries like James Legge, who were trained to be missionaries, who were like proper missionaries who studied theology, and they were trained to be missionaries. And then there were the so-called faith missionaries, who were enthusiasts, who went to China with no theological studies, no preparation. They were not priests, they were not ministers. They were just enthusiasts who went to China and they tried to share the love for Jesus with the local people. So they were the so-called faith missionaries. And the most notorious person was a British guy called James Hudson Taylor, who established the so-called China Inland Mission. So those were the people who went to China and actually lived among the Chinese and shared their lives, so to speak. But they still tried the best to maintain a Western lifestyle when they were doing that, even in the deepest Chinese countryside. They grew their own vegetables, they produced their own food, they dressed up for dinner, um, even if they lived in the jungle, where men attended in tuxedos and women in floor-length gowns, just to distinguish themselves, just to appear civilized and give an example. And so they kept gardens to grow food. And I have here another example of a missionary called Mr. Tricky, who, this is a quote, wore Chinese garb and lived in a Chinese style house. Reportedly, never ceased to be an Englishman and therefore ate pudding. So what made him like what was a proof that he was still an Englishman was that he didn't eat Chinese food. He ate only English food. Um, they also believed that converts had to eat meat to demonstrate that they are no longer vegetarians, no longer Buddhists. And the idea of civilization. So here's the quote from Hannah, James Leger's second wife, when she says that the maintenance of a full-fledged British way of life should be taken as a lesson for filthy heathens in the superiority and cleanliness of Chinese civilization. So that was the idea they had about diet in general. And then this is an interesting episode here. The first Western cookbook published in 1885 in Chinese was written by an American missionary, Martha Foster Crawford, who was from Alabama, and she was a Confederate. And she went to China to teach Christianity from the Southern perspective. She was a Southerner, and so she believed in slavery and all of those things. So she distinguished herself from the Yankees, from the missionaries who came from the northern part of the United States. Then after the Civil War, she went back to Alabama. She had a change of heart because she thought that her homeland, her motherland, Alabama, was conquered by a foreign power. So she lost everything. And so she discovered that that's how the Chinese must have felt. So she had a change of heart. She went back to China and she decided to live like a Chinese person among the Chinese, the conquered people. But she still promoted Western food and Western way of like a diet. And so she wrote this book to educate the Chinese, to teach them Christianity through food, or like to teach them civilization through food. So the big section of the book is about hygiene, preparation. There's also a list of 270 recipes. And it's very hard to pin this down, what kind of food she presents in that book. I read that book, and the recipes are not, it's very hard to say Italian, French, or what. Most of the dishes are just inventions. And I guess what makes them Western is the ingredients. They use a lot of cream, especially, or some Western style vegetables such as carrots or lettuces. So what she considered healthy, what she considered hygienic and civilized. So to improve the Chinese diet, they had to eat cream and butter and those Western things. And so I have here an example because there's a whole section in that book about curries. So I have an example here of a recipe, which is very interesting, what they understood as a curry. And so anyone who knows anything about curry, I don't know, you see that this is not what you would imagine. So to make a curry, any kind of meat can be used, but chicken is most common. Cut the chicken, so and so. Add some broth and cream into the curry and boil again. Prepare a spoon of curry powder, half a cup of cooked rice, 1 tablespoon of flour, 1 tablespoon of cream, 1 cup of broth, half a teaspoon salt. Mix together, pour the mixture over the chicken and cook for 10 more minutes. Eat over plain rice. So the only thing that here is about curry is the curry powder they put into the dish. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to identify or recognize this dish. I don't know, maybe fricassee or something like that. But it's a very weird dish. And so most of the recipes in the book are like that. And also, that also makes you wonder when James Legge ate curry, what was meant by curry? And maybe something like that. So those are like British inventions, probably. Anyway, this is just like some sort of idea I present to show you give you an idea what they ate, what they meant by Western food when they said they ate Western food. So my conclusion of my talk is that Chinese food is inedible, but Americans love it. Now somehow Chinese food became like the most popular and common food uh, in America. So on that note, I would like to conclude and thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Peter, for joining us this morning. We know it's super early or late in the middle of the night, your time, so we greatly appreciate you taking the time to be with us. Let's see. We have a question from Megan here, and she is interested in knowing more about James Legge, especially since he spent 30 years in China. And while he didn't have much contact with the Chinese cuisine, because he was in Hong Kong, and because he spent 30 years there, do you feel that he still considered the Chinese, quote, barbarians, or did he view them as equals at all, or in any way civilized? Did he respect the people that he lived with? Can we tell any of this from some of the writings that he may have done? Do you know if he had any real friendships with Chinese people? So
Yes,
a variety of questions there from Megan.
thank you for this question. That's something I should have mentioned. That's a very important point, and I neglected this to emphasize that James Legge was an exception. And he was often at odds with his own church and also with the members of his own family, like his wife. I there's a lot we can tell about his attitude towards China and Chinese people, and he was an exception. I think James Legge really stood out as a person who actually respected, or I would say liked, China. So he was often criticized, especially by the members of his church, the authorities, because he spent too much time studying Chinese classics and translating and working with Chinese people instead of doing missionary work. So they would blame him that he's neglecting his missionary duties because he's busy studying this filthy Chinese. And so I think he had a deep respect and appreciation of Chinese civilization. I don't think he considered Chinese people barbarians. I mean, probably by today's standards, probably there will be a lot of things you could say that he was a racist, but no, he was an exception, and I believe that he didn't eat Chinese food because he was genuinely, just trying to be comfortable. And also, he lived in Hong Kong. Most of the time he spent was in Hong Kong in his home, so he just ate whatever was cooked. But I think he may have tried, or he would have tried things when he went to Beijing. He tried local things whenever he thought it was safe. But the short answer is no. I don't think James Legge was. I think James Legge respected Chinese people, and he. It's very interesting when you read his translations. Those are not just translations of words and phrases, but annotations. He has a lot of footnotes and explanations, footnotes uh, explaining basically the background of the texts. So he often makes some very like snarky and remarks about the logic of those classics. They are very witty and but they are based on pure like logical, like how does that make sense, or like why did Confucius think this or that. So sometimes it's humorous, but I think he really respected Chinese people, and he worked with Chinese people on those translations. So he had friends who helped him, translate and understand those classics. So he was obsessed. He was a passionate person about China and Chinese culture. Mm.
Thank you very much for kind of shedding more light onto James, given the fact that he translated Confucian works into English. It does show that he really kind of dived deep into the Chinese culture. So it's hard to, think of him as kind of wanting to live in isolation. Excuse me, more like he would want to know more about the people. and engage with them. So what you said, yeah, rings better. Um, Sabina is asking, can you compare maybe the missionary or the proselytizing work that James Legge might have done with that of um, his name, Hudson Taylor. I think he was also James Hudson Taylor. And the impact they had on converting Chinese into Christians. Do you have any data or information that kind of talks about the the way they might have grown their um, number of people in converting them to Chinese or converting them into Christianity?
There's a lot of information, and we have direct quotes from Legge. Legge wrote about those other missionaries, those faith missionaries. He despised them. He definitely despised them. He was totally on board with his fellow missionaries who he believed that you need to have you need to be prepared to do this work. You need to be a professional. You cannot be just like some sort of they considered those people junkies who just went and like were troublemakers for them from their perspective. So James Legge despised the faith missionaries, and then also like personally, and not just his church, but he personally despised them. And as for the impact of all Christian missionaries in China, it is remarkably miserable. I mean, the Christianity didn't catch on in China. And they complain about this a lot in their writings. If you read through those the bulletins that they published at that time, they always try to cheer themselves up and say, "Oh, we got a convert or two," but in fact, they had very bad quotas and the faith missionaries, those that James Legge despised, were people who masqueraded for Chinese people. So, for example, Hudson, he would dress like a robes of a Chinese scholar and wear a fake pigtail, this kind of queue that the Chinese men had at that time, were wearing at that time he would pretend he was Chinese because he believed that if if he addresses a peasant uh, as a scholar, and the peasant will think he's a scholar because he will speak Chinese, so the peasant will take him for a Chinese scholar, and if Chinese scholar with using this authority will start talking about Jesus, then the peasant will immediately convert because he will be scared, and basically you intimidate them into. So they were using such tricks to convert people that were despicable, in fact. And so the impact was, like I don't think they were very convincing to anyone. But of course, there was money issue. They opened hospitals and other things. So some people converted because they got help from them. And so I don't know, but the impact wasn't very great, and I think James Legge also complained about it many times that he wasn't able to convert too many people, and um, um, that most people who he dealt with were already converted in Hong Kong. So, but they like all missionaries, they had quotas. They had to convert new like converts. So that was like that's what the mission was about, and that's why he was criticized very often. He had to, he built that church, like build it to prove that he was doing some sort of missionary work, but he was really passionate about Chinese studies. And so the authorities of his church were always criticizing him that you, instead of converting people and doing your job, you study those Chinese things. So they were blaming this on him in a way that he should be working harder on conversion or converting people. In fact, I mean, there are books written about it, and you can read all about this. But from my perspective, as a scholar of Chinese, when I was a student, when I was a beginner, and I didn't even know for the long time. It didn't register that he was a missionary. That was like a secondary thing. Just like you don't know that Copernicus was in fact a priest. Um, so that wasn't the main thing that stands out about James Legge, that he's a missionary. The thing that stands out, he was a sinologist. He was a person who translated the classics. He was a scholar of Chinese. So to my from my perspective, that's what if I think about James Legge, that's what I think about. I don't think of him as a missionary. I think of him as a sinologist, if that makes any sense. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that answer. Circling back to food, a question about you mentioned the missionaries growing their own food. Do you know if they raised their own livestock? Did they raise pigs, cows, or chicken? Or did they rely on meat procured from a local market?
Yeah, so they did have their own farms, especially in Shanghai, and so some of those things they later imported into the countryside from Shanghai, from big cities or Hong Kong or near Hong Kong. But they also, most notably, Europeans ate or Westerners ate beef, which the Chinese were not familiar with. And so, yes, they had their own livestock. The missionaries, the Portuguese, the Jesuits in Macau, early on in the 16th century, they butchered their own cows in Macau, which is remarkable because there was no pasture in Macau, but they still had their own cows. But they bought the pork from in China, so they had to go to the other side. I think there were periods when that was allowed, then there were periods when that was not allowed. But for some time they were able to buy. So whenever they were able to buy pork, they would buy it from the Chinese because they loved it. Chinese pigs were very different from European pigs. They were much better. And the Portuguese, not only the Jesuits, but lay Portuguese people, they raved about it, they wrote about it. Later, that race of pigs was transferred to Portugal, and so the European breeds were improved with using the Chinese breeds. So they were interbred. But yes, they would buy, especially pork, they would try to buy from the Chinese because it was better. But as for the beef, for what I know, that was a European or Western thing to do. So the Chinese were extremely shy of it. At first, they were scared when they saw Europeans eating those huge pieces of half-cooked meat. So for the Chinese, it was scary. And then there was later in Shanghai, they observed that their own diet was very meager as compared to the Europeans. So in the period of social Darwinism in the earliest 20th century, when many Chinese people believed, intellectuals, they started to believe that Chinese people are dying as a race. They thought that in order to become strong, like the Europeans, and more robust, they need to start eating more meat and specifically beef. So they were learning to eat beef from the Europeans. So they believed that what made them so strong was because they ate a lot of meat and beef specifically.
Indeed, fascinating. You made the comment about bringing the Chinese breed of pigs back to Portugal and how they integrated that. And I was also thinking about the pastries that were designed in, or yeah, created in Macau, and how we see those now in many Hong Kong style restaurants and in dim sum. When we go out for dim sum, we see those on the cart. And I've often been fascinated about, I I had the connection with the custard pastries, but not the other kind of pastries. And now I see why we see other pastries on the dim sum carts. Um, do you know if these, and I have a hunch they are more modern, but uh, were these kind of pastries that were created in Macau brought back to Portugal and eaten back in the 16th and 17th centuries, or was that more recent? Do you have any
Uh,
knowledge?
that was, yeah, it traveled back and forth. So basically, the tart is based on a pastry from Lisbon, from Belém. There's a district in Lisbon, um, and so that was like the idea. But then the specific tart, then it traveled back to Portugal too. So some pastries were, influenced by the Chinese back in Portugal. Um, so that is the case, yes.
Great. Um, Stepping away from food, Sarah is curious about the Chinese classics, and we know that they there's lots of information, and that sometimes they can be hard to digest and understand. Do you know of any easy to understand translations of the Chinese classics that would be easy to understand for a present day layperson, perhaps with not much deep contextual knowledge?
By the nature of those classics, uh, the so-called classics, I mean, they were called classics by the Jesuits, by the
Mm.
way, because they thought that they were similar to what the Westerners had, the Roman classics. So they coined the term classics, and also they coined the names Confucius and Mencius. They sound Latin, right? So they took the Chinese name Kongzi for Confucius, and they Latinized it. So that's interesting. So they actually created the idea of the Chinese the classics the word that we use in English or in Western languages. But to go back to the question, so by the nature, they're extremely hard to understand. So there's the digest, even for the Chinese readers or scholars, there's a digest of the classics, the so-called four books. So there are the five Confucian classics, and then there's the four books, which is the digest of those five. And so those are comprehensible. James Legge translated those. And you can have modern translations that are more like, the James Legge those are good translations, don't get me wrong, but they may sound a little archaic now to the modern ear. But you can have many updated translations of those. Um, and they are very readable because they were made readable for the Chinese readers as well. So if you take, for example, the Book of Mencius, which was Confucian disciple later on, that's very readable. People can read it and understand easily. But some of the classics, for example, my favorite, or what I studied for my when I was at school, that I specialized in, is you can call it like the history. Uh, it's There's the classic of Spring and Autumns, which those are the annals or the chronicles, and then there's a commentary to that, which became a classic in its own right, called the Zuo tradition. So that is an extremely complex text. And so there are bits of it that are delicious. They are delicious prose. But if you start reading it just like you would try to read a book, it's not really readable. So James Legge translated that, and that was the only English translation that existed in English until very recently, maybe 10 years ago, when a group of three American scholars translated the whole text again. That's the first new translation that exists in English only after all of those decades, after James Legge. So now it's available also in English. The whole text is available. Before that, only some selections were available that are very readable. You can read that also like short, like a basically extract of that book. But James Legge translated the whole thing. But then there are other classics like the Book of Ritual, which is not readable. That's very hard to read, and the classic of the Spring and Autumn, that's impossible to read in any even modern translation. Those are very difficult texts. So James Legge did all of that. Also, he translated the Book of Changes, which is probably maybe his less favorite translation, his least favorite book. He translated the Book of Odes, which is also extremely difficult to understand and to translate. So there have been many new updated versions of that, of the Book of Changes and the Book of Odes, the Book of Poetry. There are many translations, but I wouldn't say they are very readable because those are very difficult texts. So I personally love the Book of Odes, and I think they're beautiful. But I think 9 Chinese scholars out of 10 would say that this is horrible book and that they don't understand why Confucius loved so much those poems. But I don't know. And it's like good luck. Those are very difficult texts that are not always fun to read. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you. For folks in our audience who are interested in kind of taking a deeper dive into some of these topics, one thing we often encourage, and Peter has said he'd be happy to do that, is on the page on our website where we talk about today's program. In the coming weeks, we'll add some links to further readings, further resource materials. So that will always be archived there for those folks who want to dive deeper into some of these topics. So please check back on our website for more great info. And we have time for one more question before we end today and take a break before the tea house. And let's see, question here, coming back to the missionaries in China. The question is about, did they have servants in their household? Kind of an assumption, probably yes. And were the servants Chinese locals, or were there British folks or Europeans that they brought with them? Um, uh, and kind of, do you know much about the interaction between the missionaries and perhaps the Chinese local servants that they had?
Yeah, the Jesuits, they were using the so-called brothers, who were like young adepts that studied to be priests, and they were servants, they were cooking, they were cleaning, they were doing other things. And then they had what you could only describe as slaves, like local slaves. So they had slaves. Um, that's it. And so there's a lot of research by a famous scholar that studied the Jesuits in China, that basically he writes about those dynamics, how this worked. So that was back in the 16th, 17th century. And then the British, yes, so they had local servants. And that's what the book was for, the cookbook. So the cookbook was written in Chinese for the Chinese servants to learn how to cook Western food. So they were trained specifically to cook Western food. Um, that was the job. And uh, so they had Chinese servants, but they wouldn't eat anything Chinese or let them cook anything Chinese. Um, and they were probably treated like any help at that time you can imagine. So another thing about this that is interesting. There are two other things that are interesting, I think. In the Jesuit mission, all the Chinese who decided to become priests, like proper Catholic priests, that was mandatory. They had to convert completely to a Western way of life. So they had to learn Portuguese and Latin and all that. And they also had to be European in every appearance, including the diet and everything else. So that was a requirement. So the Chinese converts, they had to start eating meat, but they could keep their lifestyles. It wasn't required for them to become, Western, but the priests had to become Western. And then another interesting aspect of life in Macau was that there was the lay population, the Portuguese men who went to do trade and business in Macau. So there were the Jesuits, they were, priests and monks. They lived they had their own rule. They lived in their own monastery. They ate their own, they were like an order. So they couldn't, they were not lay people. But then there was a lay population, and those were mostly men. They were men, so they married local wives. And what Amaro studied were the recipes that those wives kept in the home. So she discovered those recipes and she published them and she studied them. So there were wives. So the Portuguese often married local Chinese wives, and guess what? Those wives cooked Chinese food for them, and they ate it and they liked it. The Portuguese men. So the Chinese wives were basically, sneakily transforming their households into a more Chinese fashion. Yeah. So it worked like that.
I see. Of course, there's got to be more introduction to Chinese cuisine outside of the missionaries. Um, well, that concludes our time for question and answers. Want to say thank you again to our speaker, Professor Peter Gibas, joining us from Taiwan this morning. Thank you so much for staying up late and putting together this fabulous presentation. Um, for those in our audience, we discovered Professor Gibas when he gave a talk on a similar topic at Reed College not too long ago. He, as he mentioned, has lived in Portland before and has a keen interest in Portland. So we hope to be able to invite him back as a future speaker down the road. And for those in our audience, thank you so much for tuning in this morning on a Saturday morning. Great to start our day with you joining us. Before we leave, Peter, any remarks, final thoughts would you like to share with us at all?
Thank you very much. I would love to be invited again, and I hope I could make it in person because I would love to go back to Portland. Thank you, really. It was a pleasure for me to be able to present these thoughts. So yeah, thank
Okay,
you.
great. Thank you.